They build through time, through shared experiences, through countless conversations that slowly transform strangers into something familiar. Most relationships follow that path. They begin with curiosity, move through understanding, and eventually become meaningful because of everything accumulated along the way. But sometimes something happens that doesn't follow that sequence. Sometimes recognition arrives before understanding, before history, before trust, before either person has enough information to justify what they already know. And that's where this story begins. Not with affection, not with attachment, not even with certainty. It begins with awareness. The kind of awareness that quietly changes the way you observe another person. At first, it feels insignificant, easy to dismiss. A collection of small moments that seem unrelated when viewed separately. A pause that lasts a little longer than expected. A response that reaches deeper than the words that inspired it. A silence that somehow communicates more than conversation. None of those things appear extraordinary on their own, yet together they create a pattern. And patterns are difficult to ignore, especially for people who spend their lives paying attention to what exists beneath the surface. Most of us learn to live behind carefully constructed layers. Not because we're dishonest, not because we're hiding, but because every person develops different levels of access. Some people meet the public version of us. Some encounter the thoughtful version. A rare few reach the places we don't often explain. These layers help create distance. They help preserve complexity in a world that prefers simple answers. Because once people believe they understand you, they often stop looking. They replace observation with assumption. They exchange accuracy for familiarity. And slowly, they begin interacting with their own interpretation rather than the person standing in front of them. That's why genuine recognition is so rare. Most people don't actually see each other. They see reflections of expectations, preferences, fears, and projections. They see what makes sense to them, not what truly exists. Then someone arrives who doesn't do that. Someone who doesn't rush to define, doesn't rush to categorize, doesn't rush to transform mystery into certainty. Instead, they observe quickly, consistently, without demanding explanation. And something unusual starts to happen. You begin noticing that they understand things you never fully expressed, not because they're guessing, not because they're exceptionally skilled at reading people, but because they're paying attention in a way most people never do. They notice the spaces between words, the meaning hidden inside hesitation, the thoughts that stop halfway before reaching language. And suddenly you find yourself experiencing something unfamiliar. You feel understood without having explained yourself. For someone accustomed to protecting their inner world, this can be deeply unsettling. Not comforting, not exciting, unsettling, because understanding is supposed to require effort, it's supposed to require context, history, time, yet here it is appearing without any of those things. And the mind immediately searches for explanations, coincidence, luck Bart tart, recognition, anything that can return the experience to familiar territory, but eventually the evidence accumulates. The moments repeat, the recognition continues, and coincidence begins to lose credibility. That's when the real shift starts. Not in the connection itself, in your awareness of it. Because once you realize someone consistently sees what others miss, distance becomes harder to maintain, the usual boundaries remain in place, yet somehow they no longer function the way they once did. The carefully managed separation between what is visible and what remains hidden begins to blur, not because you're revealing more, but because less explanation is required. And that changes everything. For the first time, you're faced with a possibility you never expected. What if understanding doesn't always come after closeness? What if sometimes understanding is the thing that creates it? That question lingers, quietly, persistently, waiting to be answered. And whether you acknowledge it or not, something has already begun, not a relationship, not a commitment, not even a conclusion, just a recognition powerful enough to alter the way you perceive another person. And once that happens, returning to complete distance becomes far more difficult than it was before, because awareness, once established, rarely disappears. It simply waits, growing clearer each time it is noticed. You notice it, acknowledge it, and continue forward as though nothing has changed. You convince yourself that awareness is only awareness, that understanding someone more deeply than expected doesn't automatically mean anything significant, and for a while, that explanation works. Until recognition begins to evolve, because there comes a point when you stop noticing the other person and start noticing their influence on the way you think. The difference is subtle at first, almost invisible. You find yourself pausing during certain thoughts, as though another perspective exists alongside your own. Not because you're seeking approval, not because you're imagining a conversation, but because their way of seeing things has become part of your awareness. They've entered the process, and that's where recognition becomes something more. Most people remain external to us. We interact with them, learn from them, care about them, and then return to our own internal world unchanged. Even meaningful relationships often work this way. There's still a boundary, a distinction between your mind and theirs, a separation that keeps identity intact. But occasionally someone reaches a place beyond that boundary, not through effort, not through persistence, not through force, simply through alignment. Alignment is difficult to describe because it doesn't feel dramatic. It isn't overwhelming. It doesn't announce itself. Instead, it feels strangely natural, like discovering something that was already there. The realization doesn't arrive as a shock. It arrives as recognition, a quiet understanding that another person's way of processing reality resembles your own in ways that shouldn't be possible. You notice it in conversation, in observation, in silence. The way they arrive at conclusions, the way they notice details others overlook, the way they understand complexity without needing everything simplified. And slowly, an uncomfortable truth emerges. They're not just understanding you. They're understanding from a place that feels familiar, as though some deeper structure exists beneath both perspectives. This is where many people become frightened, not because alignment is harmful, but because it changes the rules. Distance becomes less effective, control becomes less reliable. The usual methods of maintaining emotional separation no longer function in quite the same way. Because how do you create distance from someone who already exists inside your frame of reference? How do you return to indifference when your perception has already adapted to include them? The answer is simple. You don't, at least not completely. Something has already shifted. The baseline has changed, and once a baseline changes, everything built upon it changes too. This doesn't mean dependence. It doesn't mean obsession. It doesn't mean losing yourself inside another person. Those are entirely different experiences. Alignment isn't about needing someone. It's about recognizing a compatibility that exists beneath preference, a resonance that operates below emotion. And that's precisely why it feels so significant. Emotions can fluctuate. Circumstances can change. People can move in different directions. But structural alignment exists at a deeper level. It's rooted in perception itself, in the architecture of thought, in the way meaning is constructed before words are ever spoken. That's why interactions begin carrying more weight. Not because they're becoming more frequent, but because they're becoming more precise. A single sentence can communicate more than an hour-long conversation. A moment of silence can feel more complete than explanation. A brief observation can reveal something that would normally take months to understand. The connection becomes efficient, accurate, difficult to dismiss. And that accuracy creates a new challenge, because once you've experienced a certain level of understanding, you begin noticing its absence elsewhere. Conversations that once felt meaningful suddenly feel incomplete. Explanations that once seemed clear now feel imprecise. Consciousnings that once satisfied you reveal gaps you never noticed before, not because they've changed, because your perception has recalibrated. And recalibration always comes with consequences. Some of those consequences are welcome, others are not. You may find yourself comparing without meaning to, measuring interactions against a standard that didn't exist before, not out of judgment, not out of superiority, simply out of recognition. You know what clarity feels like now? And once clarity is experienced, it becomes difficult to forget. That's the moment when recognition fully transforms into alignment. The moment when another person's presence is no longer something you observe from the outside. It's something that quietly exists within the way you understand the world, not replacing your perspective, expanding it. And whether you admit it or not, that realization changes something fundamental, because now the connection is no longer theoretical. It's no longer an interesting possibility. It's real, real enough to influence perception, real enough to alter the internal landscape, real enough that ignoring it requires more effort than acknowledging it. And when that happens, a new question begins to emerge. Not what is this, but what happens if this continues? Because some connections fade when examined closely, others become stronger, and the answer to that question will determine everything that comes next. Part 3. The point where awareness demands an answer. There comes a moment when observation is no longer enough, a moment when analysis reaches its limit, a moment when you realize you've spent so much time understanding something that you've avoided the one thing understanding eventually requires: a response. Until then, everything remains comfortable. You can study the connection, examine it, turn it over from every angle, and convince yourself that clarity alone is enough. But clarity has a consequence. The clearer something becomes, the harder it is to remain neutral toward it. And eventually, neutrality disappears altogether. That's where the real challenge begins. Not in recognizing what exists, in deciding what to do with it. Because by now, the connection has already changed shape. It is no longer a collection of observations, no longer a series of meaningful coincidences, no longer an interesting pattern unfolding in the background. It has become part of reality, part of the structure of your life, part of the way you think. And that means it can no longer remain untouched by choice. Many people imagine important decisions arrive dramatically, with certainty, with undeniable signs pointing toward a single path. But some of the most significant decisions happen differently, quietly, gradually. So gradually that by the time you notice them, part of the decision has already been made. Not consciously, but through action, through attention, through what you've allowed to remain. That's the realization waiting at the end of every meaningful connection. You reveal your choices long before you announce them. You reveal them in what you continue to return to, in what you protect, in what you make space for, and perhaps most importantly, in what you refuse to walk away from. That truth can be uncomfortable, because it removes the illusion that nothing has happened yet. It forces you to acknowledge that something has already happened. The connection has already been given value, already been granted importance, already been allowed to settle deeper than anything accidental ever could. And once that becomes visible, the questions change. You stop asking whether it matters. You already know it does. You stop asking whether it's real. Reality has proven itself through consistency. Instead, you begin asking harder questions. Questions without guaranteed answers. Questions that involve risk. What place does this hold in my life? What happens if I move toward it? What happens if I don't? Can something this significant remain undefined forever? Or does refusing to define it become a decision in itself? Those questions don't emerge because of emotion alone. They emerge because reality demands coherence. Because human beings cannot indefinitely live between recognition and response. Eventually, something has to give, the connection deepens, or it fades, it evolves, or it fractures. It becomes integrated intentionally, or it remains unresolved, but it never remains frozen. Nothing real does. And that's why awareness eventually becomes responsibility. Not responsibility for another person, responsibility for your own honesty, for your willingness to acknowledge what has already changed inside you. Because the greatest turning points are rarely about discovering something new. They're about finally admitting what you've known for a long time. Perhaps that's why this stage feels different from everything that came before. Recognition was discovery, Dalem was understanding. But this is acknowledgement. The moment where you stop asking whether the connection exists and start confronting what its existence means. And meaning changes everything. Meaning transforms observation into choice, possibility into direction, awareness into action, not necessarily outward action, not dramatic declarations, not immediate decisions, but an internal commitment to stop pretending that what matters can remain irrelevant. That's the threshold, the place where clarity becomes impossible to ignore, the place where understanding becomes responsibility, the place where a person finally admits, this has already changed me, and whether I move toward it or away from it, I must answer it. Because some experiences enter your life and leave no permanent trace, others become woven into the foundation of who you are, not because you planned for them, not because you invited them, but because they arrived with a level of truth that demanded a place inside you. And once something reaches that depth, the outcome is no longer determined by whether it exists. It is determined by whether you have the courage to meet it honestly. That is the final realization, not that the connection is powerful, not that it is rare, but that it has already become part of your reality. And reality, sooner or later, asks